Hello everyone, welcome to this revision video focusing on Germany and the growth of democracy. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the impact of the First World War on Germany. So we're going to find out about Germany actually between 1914 and 1918, economic problems. We're going to focus on the defeat and the end of monarchy at the end of the First World War. Then we're going to look at how the war created lots of problems for the new Weimar Republic, including the reparations and the crisis that caused, the occupation of the Ruhr, and the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. So let's find out more. So the map shows the alliance system before the First World War and the countries in the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. It's important to know that Italy didn't actually join the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, but instead joined the war on the side of the Allies later on. But World War I was a new type of warfare. Now, the Germans had a military plan which was known as the Schlieffen Plan, and the idea of the Schlieffen Plan was that it would be a very quick invasion into France via Belgium to quickly win victory in the west and then to take their forces over and fight in the east against Russia, relying on the idea of the Russian steamroller and the idea that the Russian army would take a long time, about 6 weeks really, to mobilize, to get ready. The war, though, quickly, as you probably know, descended into trench warfare and a stalemate. And this new type of warfare was a total war. And war was brought to the European continent again, really for the first time since 1815. It was very much a new type of warfare, a total war, where all aspects of civilian life were effective. Now, there were obviously huge problems in all of the countries that fought in the First World War, but Germany was particularly effective. There was food and fuel shortages. There was political and social turbulence, and one of the big effects of the First World War on Germany was the impact of the British blockade. The British Navy blockaded northern German ports, and this accentuated the problems of food and fuel shortages in Germany during the First World War. So as we said there on that slide, the German army expected a quick and decisive victory. The German army suffered around 3 million casualties during the First World War. In Eastern Europe, the war actually went better for the Germans. They had more victories over in the east against the Russians. Russia eventually surrendered. Well, that was partly to do with the communist revolution taking place in October 1917. Russia surrendered, and on the 3rd of March, Germany made Russia sign a peace treaty, which is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was a pretty harsh treaty on Russia, and some people use this as evidence to suggest that Germany themselves deserved a harsh peace treaty at the Treaty of Versailles because they had done pretty much the same to Russia in March 1918. Anyway, in the early part of 1918, in the spring of 1918, Germany tried to achieve a decisive breakthrough in what was called the Spring Offensive, or sometimes known as the Ludendorff Offensive, after the German general in charge, General Ludendorff. And the Germans actually did really, really well. They achieved a breakthrough of around about 40 miles in some places. But this breakthrough stalled by the summer of 1918. And what happened is, with the Americans having joined the war in 1917, the Allies, with those sort of American soldiers who were fresh into the war, they were able to launch a major counterattack, and became clear that Germany would be defeated. Now, what I really want you to understand from that is that the defeat of the German military during the First World War, when it came, was actually pretty rapid, pretty quick, and pretty unexpected. And this obviously gave rise to the idea of the stab in the back myth. Now, when in September 1918, the German generals told the Kaiser Wilhelm, that they couldn't win and that a ceasefire was necessary, the Kaiser was absolutely astonished. He was shocked by this. And eventually, after the German Revolution and the mutiny at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in October 1918, the Kaiser ended up abdicating, fled to Holland, and the army surrendered on the 11th of November 1918. But the Kaiser was obviously gone by then. So just in terms of the economic and social impact of World War I on Germany, to understand the state that Germany was in 1918, at the end of the war, it's important to understand the economic and social impact that the First World War had on Germany. Now you can see there's a map which shows you really clearly the blockade of German ports by the British Navy. Now, this blockade was absolutely crucial because it stopped Germany from being able to import supplies from overseas. It caused huge food and fuel shortages, and many German people were left eating quite simple diets of things like turnips and bread. Now, the food shortages, of course, led to unrest. There were some elements within German society, particularly supporters of the Social Democrats, who turned against the war, and a new political party was formed actually from that, called the USPD. Huge economic problems, lack of consumer goods for people to buy as factories turned to producing weapons and war supplies. By 1918, there's a good fact to learn, the German industry was producing only 2/3 of what it had done in 1913. And the German government simply began to run out of money and supplies. It struggled to support families. Wages were low, but there were some factory owners that profiteered, and this caused resentment. Remember, there had already been an increase in the gap between rich and poor in Germany before 1914, and that only got worse during the First World War. By 1918, there was an increase in strikes and people demanding peace and a democratic government. So Germany, the picture there that you've got is that during the First World War, Germany is really unstable, and there's lots of problems for the Kaiser in terms of his leadership of Germany. So in terms of the political impact of World War I, we've mentioned briefly the mutiny at Kiel. So in Kiel in October 1918, there was a mutiny. That's when the sailors there refused to obey orders. They took over the naval base. They joined with the local dock workers to demand democracy and peace. And this revolution quickly spread across Germany. And when the end came for the Kaiser, in terms of his abdication, it came pretty quickly. He abdicated, which means resigned the throne, on the 9th of November 1918. And as we said, he left for Holland. Now, Germany then became a republic, which would later, of course, be called the Weimar Republic. And a democratic government would be set up, with Friedrich Ebert taking the role as the first president of Germany. He, of course, was the leader of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, as it's known in Germany. Now, we've already said about how the defeat of Germany came quickly and swiftly when it came in 1918, and in fact it was so quick that it shocked very many people in Germany. Now, because of press censorship in Germany during the First World War, the newspapers had very much focused on the stories of German success. From the point of view of the German people, in March 1918, the German army had finally defeated Russia, and Russia had sued for peace at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So there became this idea that Germany actually hadn't been defeated in the First World War, but had instead been stabbed in the back by weak politicians who were known as the November Criminals. So the idea of the November Criminals becomes quite pervasive in Germany in the 1920s. It becomes quite a widespread political idea, particularly among the right wing, groups like the Nazis and the German Nationalist Party, the DNVP, for example, gets currency with people like Wolfgang Kapp when he tries to organise the Kapp Putsch. And we have a look at this election poster from 1924, for the election in 1924, and the poster says, "Who stabbed the German armies in the back in the World War? Whose fault is it that our people and fatherland must sink so deep into misfortune?" So this becomes one of the key problems that the Weimar Republic has to deal with during this time when it is in power. So this new Weimar Republic is created, and one of the big things it has to do in 1919 is it has to agree to the peace treaty. Now, an armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, but the armistice was just a ceasefire. And although Germany had to agree to certain things at the armistice, such as the demilitarization of the Rhineland and giving up its navy and its submarines, for example, the Treaty of Versailles was what actually brought about a state of peace between Germany and the Allies. The British blockade continued all the way up until July 1919, so it kind of meant that really Germany didn't have any choice but to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the key terms of the Treaty of Versailles, you need to know about the land. So Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, plus all of its overseas colonies. The Rhineland was demilitarized. There was lots of other territories they lost, such as Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark, Memel to Lithuania, for example. The Polish corridor was given to Poland. So lots and lots of territorial terms in that. Germany wasn't allowed to unite with Austria either. In terms of military restrictions, the army was restricted to 100,000 soldiers. There was no navy allowed, no air force, only 6 battleships, and no submarines. In terms of money, now the big three actually couldn't agree the price of reparations. The French wanted 44 billion, the British 24 billion, and the US 4.4 billion. And a commission was set up to decide the final bill, and it would actually agree it at around about 6.6 billion in the end. So it was actually at the lower end of the reparations, even though Germany was very angry about the reparations. Now, quite a lot of sources that you'll come across focus on the cost of reparations, and they might come from 1919, but it is just worth remembering that the actual amount of reparations was not agreed at the time. One of the most controversial aspects of the Treaty of Versailles was Article 231. This said that Germany had to accept the blame for starting the First World War, which of course many German people said was quite unfair. The German people particularly didn't like the fact that they didn't get an opportunity to have their own say at the Treaty of Versailles, and they were forced to sign it, and that's referred to as the diktat. Yeah, so picking up the whole idea about why Germany disliked the Treaty of Versailles, one of the things to think about is the idea of President Woodrow Wilson. He made a speech in January 1918 where he outlined his, quote, 14 points, which are focused on principles like self-determination, that countries could decide who could run them. The terms of Wilson's 14 points would have been pretty lenient, actually, to Germany. And so many German people, because of this, expected the peace treaty to be relatively lenient towards them. Many Germans felt the treaty meant Germany couldn't defend itself. They felt that the reparations would be far too much, or remember, the reparations weren't set in 1919. We've already talked about the diktat. It really accentuates this idea of the November criminals and the stab in the back myth. And I think a nice fact just to think about is that flags flew at half-mast across the country, huge demonstrations in the streets, and this political cartoon, which was published in 1919, just really kind of sums up how Germany feels. You know, we know that before the First World War even, Germany owed 489 billion marks. We know what a devastating economic impact the First World War itself had on Germany, and so the Treaty of Versailles just heaped on further problems for Germany and made it a very, very difficult country for its leaders within the Weimar Republic to actually run and control. So just picking up some of the legacies of the Treaty of Versailles, obviously the reparations were set at quite high, and in 1922 Germany announced it could no longer afford the reparations, but France was very determined that Germany should pay. So in 1923, 60,000 French and Belgian soldiers occupied an industrial area that was known as the Ruhr. And you can just see on that map there, we can see there's the Rhineland, and just north of Cologne, you can see the Ruhr industrial area. So it's not too far really from France and Belgium. So French and Belgian soldiers, they come across the Rhineland into the Ruhr and they occupy these areas. Now they occupy these areas because this is the industrial heartland of Germany. There's mines, there's factories, and basically the idea that France and Belgium have is that they can take payment for the reparations in kind, in goods. So the French and Belgian soldiers, they seize control of mines, factories and railways. The workers protest, and the German government, Weimar Republic, supports them within this through a policy of what's known as passive resistance. So the workers in the Ruhr, basically, they down their tools, they refuse to work, they sabotage, so they flood the mines, they set fire to factories. It's tense. 140 German workers are killed in clashes with French and Belgian soldiers, and so this creates economic chaos basically within Germany, because not only can Germany actually not afford the reparations, but now they kind of destroyed their own industrial area, the Ruhr, as well. And this leads to a huge problem because the German government responds by paying the workers in the Ruhr and keeping the government going by printing more banknotes. And the problem with printing banknotes is that leads to inflation and eventually very, very rapid inflation, which is known as hyperinflation. Now, we know quite a bit about inflation living at the current times, but this is inflation that is just completely out of control. In fact, inflation that's so out of control that money essentially becomes worthless. So there's lots of different stats you can see in terms of hyperinflation, but I think one of the best ways to understand the impact of the hyperinflation crisis is simply this picture. It shows German children playing with banknotes, and essentially they're playing with paper because the money isn't worthless. There's some great stories. There's a story of the person that's, whether it's a bit of a myth, who knows, but the story of a person that's going through the streets with a wheelbarrow full of money. They get robbed, but of course their banknotes get left behind, and the wheelbarrow is stolen. The stories of people that are using their banknotes to burn because it's cheaper to do that than burn firewood. So you can see that $1 is worth 200 billion marks by November 1923. So basically the German currency becomes worthless, and people have to resort to things like bartering, swapping goods and things like that, and the economy ceases to function. So there's lots of losers in hyperinflation, particularly people with lots of cash savings, and especially people on fixed incomes, such as people with pensions, people who are paid monthly, so quite a lot of professional people like doctors, lawyers, teachers, that sort of people. The people whose wages don't keep up with the price rises, they lose. And you can have a pause and read that source just to kind of get that impression of the impact of the hyperinflation crisis. But whenever there's a loser, there's also a winner. So people with debts, for example, could repay them with worthless money. People with goods such as land that kept their value, well, they would win. Some workers were paid daily, so perhaps wouldn't describe them completely as winners, but they certainly don't lose as much as those that are paid monthly. Some people made good deals, profits through bartering, and big businesses gained as prices rose faster than wages. There was also, I really like this example of Hugo Steins, who's known as the inflation king and also gets known as the king of the Ruhr as well. So when businesses start to go bankrupt because of the hyperinflation crisis, bigger businesses manage to basically hoover up those smaller businesses and take them over. They can profit from the economic situation by borrowing cheaply, investing in new industrial enterprises. So Hugo Steins, he controls 20% of Germany's industry by the end of 1923. So there's lots of examples of winners and losers in the hyperinflation crisis. So overall, Germany faced a lot of problems between 1919 and 1922, and lots of these, they came from the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles. So there's economic problems with the reparations being announced in 1921 at 6.6 billion, led to the hyperinflation crisis. There's political opposition, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail in another video, but there's the Spartacus Rising of 1919, the Cat Putsch of 1920. Putsch, by the way, is a German word for an uprising. And there's just a lot of political instability during this time. There's lots of political assassinations. The new government is based initially in Weimar until September 1919 because Berlin is too unstable. And the idea of November criminals and the stab in the back myth just continues to cause problems. So Germany is a very sort of unstable place, both economically, socially, and also politically during this time. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and good luck. Thank you.